I am here with Dr. Larry Allen Busk, who is a philosophy professor at Florida Gulf Coast University. Hi, Larry. Thanks for
Hi,
joining us.
thank you
Super
so much.
excited to talk to you about your ideas when it comes to democracy. But could you tell us, like in theory, what is democracy?
Yeah, I mean, you have it on your card there. It's sort of a mashup of these two ancient Greek words, right? Demos meaning people, in some sense, and kratos meaning rule, power, government, something like this, right? So democracy is rule by the people, government by the people. The difficult question is, well, what exactly does that mean? So in our kind of contemporary democratic states, we take that to mean basically representative democracy. It means everybody gets a vote and you vote on who you want to be in power politically on some level. Theorists will, some theorists are fine with that. Some theorists say, well, real democracy has to mean more direct participation. So everyone actually meets and makes decisions together. Some other theorists think democracy has to have a more kind of profound meaning than just, well, periodically we get together and make a few decisions, right? Things like this. So there's a lot of debates and contestation about what exactly it means for the people to rule. Um, yeah, happy to
When you,
say anything more about that if one
yeah,
of those ideas piques your interest.
yeah, when you say a representative gets voted on by the people to do the ruling, what's
Hmm.
interesting is that representative is still a person. So it's still a
Hmm.
person doing the ruling. So obviously you mean something special when you say the people doing the ruling. So what's like the people? Does that mean
Yeah.
something special?
Yeah, I mean, so theoretically, the new thing or the special thing or the innovative thing about democracy is that regardless of who's actually making the decisions, whether it's a president or a prime minister or the whole parliament or some more sophisticated, that their decisions are sort of authorized, if you like, or legitimated, made something like, reasonable or legitimate, right, by the authority, what some theorists call the constituent power, right? The um, I want to say normative. It's a bit of a abstract word. The thing that makes it just, right? The thing that makes it good, the thing that makes it authoritative comes from the people. That's the idea, as opposed to in older forms of political organization where a king could just rule as he liked, and there was no idea that the king had some responsibility to the people. The king ruled because he was king. That's where his power came from the fact that he was the monarch. A president, again, at least in theory, we have the idea that a president's power is bestowed upon them by the people that the president represents.
Mm.
Um, so that's the kind of, again, theoretical idea behind democracy, is that even if individual people are, individual persons are making decisions, ultimately the power comes from and resides in the people as a whole. Now, of course, there's some more sticky questions about who counts as part of the people and who doesn't, but that's a whole other can of worms there.
Yeah. So setting that part aside, like who's the people, who's not,
Mhm.
what's the value of democracy?
The there's probably a solid 100 answers we could give here you could find in the literature, but I think they all boil down ultimately to some variation on the claim that people, individuals, each person, right, or communities or something like this, ought to have some say in what happens to them. So there's just this kind of basic foundational claim in a lot of literature that if some decision affects me, if some law, some tax, whatever it is, some political thing that's happening, if it affects me, I ought to have some say in that, right? I ought to, by virtue of the fact that I'm impacted by it, right, have some measure of control over what happens. So, one way you could think about that is ideas about autonomy, right? Self-control, self-determination, something like that. I think that's the idea kind of at the core of a lot of democratic theory.
So when I ask you what's the value of democracy, you're telling us that one way to answer the question is that we value autonomy, which is people somehow in some way governing themselves. And then democracy allows us to be self-governing.
That sounds right to me. Regardless of sort of what kind of democratic theory you like, or what form of democracy, of a direct, representative, some other kind, right? I think ultimately it all boils down to how best can people reasonably exert control over their own lives, something like that.
So we hear sometimes people say things like democracy is an end in itself. But first of all, like, what would that even mean, an end in itself? But also, is democracy an end in itself?
Yeah. Talking about something as an end in itself is kind of philosophers speak for saying that it doesn't need anything else to justify it for its own existence, right? Like, if you think of something that you do just for the sake of something else, right? Like, I don't enjoy putting gas in my car. That's not a fun activity. I do that as a means to the end of going somewhere, right? I don't even really enjoy driving, actually. Driving is just a means to the end of getting from point A to point B, right? If something's an end in itself, then it kind of doesn't make sense to say or to ask, right, why is that good? What makes that good, right? I, enjoy a good cup of coffee. And you could say, well, it's a means to the end of getting perked up or something like this, right? But that's not really why I drink it. I drink it just because I enjoy it, right? It just has value to me in and of itself. Why do I want to enjoy things? That's not really a question we would ask anyone, right? Enjoying your life is just kind of an end in itself. It's just kind of has its own value. It's good because it's good, right? Something like this. And so the tendency, especially over the last, half century or so, both in the real world politics and in political theory, has been to think of democracy as just this thing that has value because it does, right? It doesn't need a justification. It doesn't need a, well, it's good because of these things. It's but it's just the end, right? The kind of, if you like, controversial thing that I want to argue in my book, there it is again, Democracy in Spite of the Demos. The thing that I want to argue is that we shouldn't actually think of it as an end in itself. And that actually, if we start to look, we'll find that most people don't really think of it as an end in itself, even if they think they do. Most theorists, especially, who are fixated on this idea of democracy as an end in itself, I think if we sort of push their theories a little bit, we'll see that really they don't think of democracy as an end in itself. They think of it more like the car example I gave earlier, more as just a means to get somewhere else.
Okay, so let's further explore this idea. So can you try to gesture at why it's false to think democracy is an end in itself?
Yeah, so let's just take the most basic understanding of democracy, like the one that we kind of operate with, not when we're doing theory, but just in the real world, right? Okay, everyone gets a vote and we elect our leaders or something like this. I wonder what happens in those cases where they might be totally hypothetical, or they might be closer to real life than some of us would like to admit. But what about those cases where, through an electoral process, someone with truly kind of morally objectionable ideas comes into power? Or so suppose there's what do they call these things? Referendums, right? Suppose there's a referendum to, let's say, disenfranchise a group of people, right? Restrict them of the right to vote or participate in politics, right? A racially defined group, whatever you like, right? I would regard such a thing as just morally totally unacceptable. But suppose this was put to a vote and it passes with, I don't know, 60% of the vote, 80% of the vote, 51% of the vote, whatever. This is a case where I would say, well, not just that the democratic process failed or that democracy got it wrong this time, we'll try better next time, but as something basically unacceptable, something that we can't just say, well, we'll do better next time, so it goes, right? Or to take another example, I spent a lot of time thinking about climate change and the climate catastrophe. And if you look at public opinion polls, there's a pretty severe gap between the scientific consensus on anthropogenic, meaning human-caused climate change, and what people think about it. Whether that's, with regard to whether or not it's happening at all, or if it's happening, if it's human caused, if it's happening, how quickly, what will the consequences be? People are generally, you could say misinformed, you could say ignorant, you could, in any case, their views do not align with the scientific consensus. And assuming there's some kind of politically meaningful decisions to be made on that front, then I think it's a really spectacularly bad idea to, if you like, entrust decisions about climate change to a demos, right, a people who are, it seems, just sort of doggedly underinformed or misinformed or ignorant of the realities of climate change, right? So, for example, let's say, that the scientific community is telling us we need to cut down on plastic production now, right? Not next year, not in 5 years, now, to keep greenhouse gas emissions down, right? Well, okay, that might be the scientific reality, but if you put that to a vote or something like this, it might not pass, right? People like plastic bags; they don't want to give up plastic bags, so people might vote against plastic bags. A plastic ban. I'm saying plastic bag ban. So to my mind, that represents this hard case where we have to say, in this case, democracy is not only wrong, but sort of severely misguided to a certain, to the extent that it's not quite right to say that democracy is the way to go in this case. I don't know, how much sense am I making here? Is this
Lots of
helpful or
sense.
less helpful? Okay.
Yeah, so let me see if I've got that right. You think this is false. You think it's false that democracy is an end in itself.
Mhm.
And your scenario is, well, if you let the people rule and the people are wrong,
Mhm.
then we're going to have a bunch of bad stuff happen. So it's not the case that democracy is just valuable for no other reason.
Yeah, that sounds right. That sounds right. Yeah, especially think that's it becomes especially true when we're talking about a problem like climate change, which represents, an existential threat, right? Because the stakes now are not, even a matter of will certain people be mistreated or will some injustice take place, but will the human species have a habitable climate in 100 years?
Mm.
And when the stakes are that high, it becomes difficult to say, well, regardless of what happens, regardless of any consequences, we need to maintain democracy.
Do you think that if we had an educated people making educated votes, then we would see that democracy has value? Or do you think that there is no value of democracy? How far away from this claim do you go?
Yeah, I go pretty far away, not so far as to say that democracy is by default bad or always bad or has to be bad or something like this. Some philosophers have made that claim. I don't think that's the case. I think that with a differently constituted demos, a different people, basically. However, that could be accomplished. That's a very difficult thing to imagine, but I think that with a different people, democracy could be just fine. But I find this tendency a lot in, especially a theoretical tradition called deliberative democracy, where these people want to say, well, democracy as such is not good, but democracy after everyone has engaged in rational debate, right, and has been
Mm.
informed of all the facts and so on and so forth, then that's good. And that might be a lot closer to the truth, or to what's right. But it just seems to me that in that case, it comes down to, well, who decides what's rational or who decides what's reasonable? And if it's not the people already, if it's not people democratically deciding what's a rational mode of communication, then the whole thing just kind of seems like a non sequitur, and we might as well be anti-democrats, or at least non-democrats by that point, and leave the question of democracy out of it, and just say, well, we don't want rule by the people, we want rule by reason, or something like this.
Mm.
If that makes any sense.
Somehow, yeah, I'm wondering if there's something in here about like objectivity versus subjectivity, or whether morality is objective or subjective. Say we talk more about your example. Your example was, say, about climate change, but let's make it something like different. Sexism or racism. If the people are 51% racist and they vote for a representative, a president who is racist, is your view that there's some kind of problem here, because then democracy did what it was supposed to do, but that's unacceptable? And then your assumption is that racism is bad? Like, where did we get the idea?
Yeah.
Where did we get the idea that racism is bad if 51% of the people are racist? Is there a problem like this here?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very similar problem. And folks, the folks that I'm kind of arguing against will say something like, well, no, if something is racist, or a candidate is racist, then they're automatically not democratic. Because democracy has to include some idea of just fundamental equality, right? And that cuts against the idea of racism, right? I don't find that a very satisfying response, for a couple of reasons. One, because, well, it just kind of stretches the limits of conversation, I think, or sensible terms, if we can say something like, well, this candidate was elected with 60% of the vote, but that's not democratic, because what this person thinks is not democratic. Yeah, but they were elected with 60% of the vote, so how can we say it's not democratic, right? We have to say something like, the people are not behaving democratically. And that it just seems so oxymoronic. It's like, well, by definition, however the people are behaving is democratic, right? If we're talking about someone who won with 60% of the vote.
Right.
But I think a more fundamental problem there, and this is much more a problem in the real world than in theory, I would say, is that very few people, relatively few people, will come out in these days, in 2021 in the United States. Very few people will say things like, I am a racist, I support racism, I am in favor of racist policies, right? They won't say that. I don't know how specific you want to get here, but there's essentially not a debate over whether or not racism is good or bad. For the most part, everyone agrees that racism is bad. There's a debate about what racism means, right? What racism sort of affects, right? Is racism still a problem in the United States, right? Most of my friends and colleagues would say yes, but a very, very sizable portion of the American electorate would say no. Racism has been solved. It's been solved for 50 years. Why are we still talking about it? It's not a thing anymore, right? Maybe it was in the past, whatever, but all that's fixed now, right? Now, that's not really a debate per se about morality or something like this. It's a debate about reality, right? Someone I'm sitting across the table from might say to me with a straight face, yeah, there is a oppressed group in the United States today, and it's white people. We're the victims. White people are the victims of political correctness and so on and so forth. Every other group has already achieved equality, and now white people are cast as villains, and so on and so forth. Now, I would have a very severe disagreement with that person, but not over the morality, but over reality, right?
Reality.
Over,
Hmm.
I don't think what you're saying is true. I don't think what you're saying adequately reflects the way things really are. And so then it just becomes a question of ignorance and misinformation again.
Interesting. Well, you have a ton of ideas in your book. I want to ask about one last one. You talk about how the people have an ability to resist social structures like racism, sexism, or to reinforce those social structures. And I was wondering if you could explain what that means.
Yeah, yeah. So that really comes out of that's a good question, because it kind of gets at the heart of why I wrote this book, right? I was just reading a lot of democratic theory, reading a lot of people talking about democracy, reading a lot of sort of ideas of democracy as an end in itself. And these folks love to point to examples. They love to point to things in the real world and say, look, these people are enacting democracy. These people are performing democracy. This is democracy at work, right? And inevitably, they point to things like Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, these sorts of things in a very broad sense associated with the political left in the United States, or progressive politics in some sense, using the term very broadly. But the thing is, like, at a purely kind of formal level, sort of like at the level of what's happening, right? People are in the street demanding something, right? Occupy Wall Street was people in the streets demanding an end to income inequality. Black Lives Matter is people in the street demanding an end to police violence and other things, right? So it's just at the level of people in the streets demanding something. Well, we could also talk about men's rights activists, right? Or the Proud Boys, any given Proud Boys rally, right? Those are people in the streets demanding an end to feminism, right? Or an end to, what are the Proud Boys even demanding? They're demanding an end to the oppression of white people, I guess, or something like this. I'm not really, I don't know how to describe them, but people in the streets demanding something, right? And demanding an end to what they take to be, in a very misguided way, but they take to be a relationship of subordination, right? Men are being subordinated to feminism. White Americans are being subordinated to multiculturalism, things like this. So at a purely formal level, these should seem to count as instances of democratic contestation, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the democratic theorists just conveniently don't talk about those, right? They just forget to mention all those aspects, or all those instances where the people make their voices heard, but what they're saying is either profoundly ignorant, offensive, misguided in some way, pathological in some way, right?
So if we had a bunch of people in the streets demanding we bring back slavery,
right.
that's democracy.
It would have to be
Formal.
according to these theories of democracy. But we don't want to say that, and we certainly don't want to say that that's good. So then I think that forces us to admit, to get back to this this note card, right? It forces us to admit that democracy is not an end in itself, right? I don't believe in slavery, and I think slavery is wrong. And even if 60% of the people voted to bring back slavery, I would say no, slavery is wrong. I don't care what democracy says. I'm willing to sacrifice democracy if it means no slavery, right?
Wow.